Well, ladies and gentlemen, when I am wearing this, I am Lorenzo Hernandez, the navigator from La Victoria, the second of Cabrillo's ships. Sometimes I dress for the 18th century, sometimes for the 16th. I really spend very little time in the 21st century. And when I talk to kids in field trips here, one of the things I emphasize is the fact that the people who came before us were just as smart as we are. Didn't have computers and trucks and trains and planes, but they were just as smart as we. In fact, every bit of mathematics and geometry that you will study through the end of high school was developed by the Greeks 3,000 years ago. Most of the architecture and engineering that holds up our buildings was old news to the Romans 2,000 years ago. There are more than 200 major languages in the world, but only one number system that anybody still uses: Arabic numerals, brought to Europe by the Crusaders in the 1200s, developed in Persia about 2,000 years ago. A number system so simple that it hasn't been improved on since, and no other alternative. Think about Roman numerals. Try to add, subtract, multiply, and divide in Roman numerals. Makes your brain hurt to even think about it. Right? So, although they did not have computers, did not know what caused disease, it wasn't that they were at all dumb. And they had to do most of the same things that we have to do. They found other ways to do them. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about the age. How many people of you have heard that Columbus sailed in order to prove the world was not flat? Well, the fact is, no educated person ever believed the world was flat. Ever. When you see the shadow of the Earth projected on the moon during a lunar eclipse, it's the shadow of a sphere. You go back to Greece 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, get yourself a statue or a picture of an Atlas holding up the world. He's not holding up anything that looks like a pizza. No. These people knew that the Earth was a sphere. Okay. But they were limited by the technology of their age. Columbus had to wait until 1542 because it wasn't until then that they actually had ships that were sturdy enough, would actually hold out the water long enough to give him a chance of wandering across the Atlantic. He studied the winds, and he knew that in the Atlantic, the winds go in a clockwise direction. He was betting on that to take him over to Asia. See, he didn't know that North and South America were here. He thought the other side of the Atlantic would be Asia. He was kind of disappointed, actually. Spain figured out it wasn't Asia and started taking over. First, they took over the Caribbean, then moved on to Mexico and the conquest of the Aztecs. All of this world, and of course, 50 years later, after Columbus, 1542, Cabrillo comes up this coast, once again hoping to get to Asia, like Columbus, to fill a ship with silks and spices and get rich selling them at enormous profits back in Europe. Think about the courage of men who prepared to go that far. No maps, no idea what they were really getting into. Just a certain assumption, which, as it turns out, was totally wrong. Now, before I can explain how that was done, we have to do a little bit of a review. Are you 5th grade, did you say? Would you be my assistant for a moment? What is your name?
Sylvia.
Sylvia. So you stand right here. I'll take your glasses off, please. All right. Oh, put them up on here. Somebody will step on them. All right. Stand nice and straight. Head up. Relax. This won't hurt much. I want you to imagine that Sylvia's head is a globe. Okay? Out in space, above the North Pole, is the North Star. As the Earth rotates, can you rotate for us? Slowly, takes a whole day to go around. Slowly. As the Earth rotates, all of the other stars appear to be moving. But because of its unique location directly above the North Pole, the North Star appears to be fixed in the sky. If you're standing at the North Pole, looking at the North Star, you're looking straight up. On the other hand, if you're out here at the equator, there it is. The North Star appears very, very low on the horizon. Now, I know that you know about latitude and longitude because you're a fifth grader.
Yes.
For those of you who haven't studied latitude and longitude recently, we'll do a quick review. Longitude, yes, hey, just because you know doesn't mean they know. Longitude are the lines that go up and down from pole to pole. Latitude goes across east to west, starting at, you ready for this? The equator. Starting at the equator and going in both directions, 10, 20, 30, 40, finally 90 degrees north latitude at the North Pole, 90 degrees south latitude at the South Pole. Thank you very much. Would you give Sylvia a hand? The next time your teacher needs a globe in class, you can volunteer because now you have experience, right? Don't forget to get your glasses. Okay. All right. This, ladies and gentlemen, is called a quadrant. Now, I made this one. It is not the very one that Columbus used, but it is incredibly similar. A quadrant, a quarter of a circle. Using the degrees, came up by those clever Greeks 3,000 years ago. If I'm standing at the North Pole, looking at the North Star, and shooting a bearing on that star overhead, my plumb line tells me I'm at 90 degrees north latitude, the North Pole. On the other hand, if I'm at the equator, looking at that North Star low on the horizon, shooting along that same edge now, my plumb line tells me I'm at 0 degrees, the equator, or anywhere in between. So if you know that the port of San Diego is at 32 degrees north latitude, all you have to do is sail north or south until you're on that latitude line. Sail due east until you find your way into the port here in San Diego. Now, if that seems absurdly simple, well, of course, I've simplified it a little bit. Right? You can imagine how crude, how rough an estimate this would give you. But you would want to know some additional things. For instance, if you knew that this wind along this coastline almost always blows from the south to the north, from the north to the south, well, you'd come in at 33 or 34 degrees north latitude and then follow the coastline. That's the easiest way to get from one port to the next using landmarks. You're coasting. The easiest way to get along. You probably have some people at work who are coasting, right? Now you say, well, the North Star. Boy, in the North Atlantic, you can go for weeks and not be able to see us in the winter. Well, remember I told you, these folks are very clever. Even ancient peoples recognized that in the summertime, the sun rises in the east, goes directly overhead to set in the west. But in the wintertime, it goes from the rises in the east and goes across the southern hemisphere to set in the west. Back to those Greeks, they knew what they were doing. They were the ones who actually came up with the idea of latitude and longitude. Right? No, you can use this same instrument with the sun. You're going to measure the angle of the sun at its highest point. High noon is not a time, it's a celestial event. The highest point of the sun and its arc across the heaven each day. Once again, you're going to shoot along that same edge and determine that angle. If you know the angle and you know the date, you can now mathematically derive your line of latitude. And eventually, it will be published in tables. Latitude alone, absent longitude, was very, very useful because most coastlines do run north and south. If you knew the latitude of the port to which you were bound, an instrument as simple as a quadrant will go a long way toward getting you there. Now you say, oh, that seems different. Certainly we've come up with a better way to do it than that. Not exactly, no. This is a quadrant, a quarter of a circle. This is a modern sextant. a sixth of a circle that operates exactly the same way. Much more accurate. Lots of bells and whistles. Right? But the same basic technology we've been using for 500 years. This sighting device here uses a piece of smoked glass so you can actually see the sun without jeopardizing your vision. How many of you have seen pictures of pirates with a patch over one eye? Well, there were lots of ways to lose an eye on board ship, no question about it. But the fellow who has to take this bearing is now looking directly at the sun. He might very well put a patch over his, in most cases, his right eye, his dominant eye, in order to take that bearing. And if that eye suffers double vision or damage, why, he then covers the damaged eye with that patch and goes on from there. It wasn't just pirates who were wearing patches in the days of sailing. Well, if that seems all that elaborate, well, there are even simpler ways, really. This, believe it or not, is also a navigation device. Now this, of course, is a sand glass. It is not an hourglass, it is a half hourglass. So down there, it's not tightening up. On every ship, all the way back to Columbus, and before really, there was a sand glass, a 30-minute glass right next to the compass. Every half hour, when the glass is run out, we're going to turn it. And every time the glass is run, we're going to ring the ship's bell. At the first turn of the glass, half an hour, 1 bell. At the second turn, 1 hour, 2 bells. By the time we're up to 4 hours, 8 bells. Eight bells is as high as we go, because sailors will work for 4 hours and then be off for 4 hours. When 8 bells rings, half of the crew, either the port or the starboard watch, whichever is working gets to go below, get some food and some sleep. The other half, they have to get to work until they hear 8 bells ring again. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, all the way around the clock. Meant the sailors never got more than 4 hours sleep at a time. It tended to make them rather cranky. The next time you hear those bells in a movie or TV show, right, you can raise your hand and say, let me tell you about that. Show off a little bit. And in your history book, especially for 5th grade, you'll often see a compass and a sand glass as part of the illustration. But they don't explain how the sand glass was used in navigation, which I'm about to show you. Every half hour, when the glass was turned and the bell was rung, they're going to take note of the ship's course and speed. The course comes off the compass. After several hours of sleep, the captain can get up and look at the ship's log and say, well, we started right here. At the course and speed indicated, the first half hour put us here, then here. The next half hour, we must be right here. Now that form of navigation used to be called deduced reckoning. Nowadays we simply call it dead reckoning. If you hear somebody say they found their way by dead reckoning, it's not guesswork, it's simple mathematics. We know our course and our speed, we know and our point of origin. And we can therefore massage those numbers to give us our location on any reasonably accurate map. And if you're lucky enough to be able to take a bearing on a landmark or an island like that, why, now you've got 2 very distinct navigational modes to compare one to the other. Now, I mentioned coasting, right? But in fact, that's just one of a great many phrases that date back all the way to the age of Cabrillo and the exploration of the New World. As I said, these folks were very sophisticated in their own way. If you look at the ship over there, why, there are just about 100 different lines on that ship. Each one controlling a different aspect of the sails. some holding up the mast, some holding the yard, the big wooden piece that goes across and holds on which the sail is detached. Right? If you were a new sailor on such a ship, the very first thing that you would have to learn is which lines control which sails in what way. And if you have to go back to work tomorrow, well, and there's somebody new at your place of employment, the boss may expect you to show him the ropes. Those are the ropes you're talking about, because English is a nautical language from an island in the Atlantic. We use nautical terms all the time. If at New Year's you have a friend who's perhaps imbibed a little too heavily, why, you might say he's lost 3 sheets to the wind. Well, in that phrase, the sheets are not the sails, although they were often called sheets. It was an abbreviation of the lines that hold the sheet down, anchored at the top across the yard and then held down into the wind by the sheet lines. The big squaresails, 4 sheet lines. All right? Now, in steering a sailing ship, you used mostly your sails, not the helm. The rudder was merely for small adjustments in course. If you tried to even make a right-hand turn with the helm, you'd probably capsize. No. If you get into a typhoon, perhaps off India, why? And the wind is blowing so hard it shears 3 of those 4 sheet lines. Now your mainsail is flapping uselessly in the breeze, and by extension, you've pretty much lost control of the ship. You've lost 3 sheets to the wind. And if your friend continues to imbibe, what's he going to do? He's going to keel over. We are connected to our history in all sorts of ways. Now, I mentioned to you some of the ways this was used, but there were jobs aboard ship that you could not do for 4 hours at a stretch. If you were the helmsman, wrestling that wheel, or in the case of a 15th century ship, something called a whipstaff. Kind of like an airplane joystick, no? Except if the wave hits it, that whipstaff comes along and knocks you across the room. A whipstaff. If you're the helmsman, wrestling that whipstaff or wheel, holding her to hold your course, by the end of a half hour, you're probably exhausted. If it's a cold winter night and you're up and the cross tree says, look out, you're probably not at your best for more than a half an hour. For those particular jobs, a new sailor would take over every time the glass was turned, every time the bell was rung. The man at the wheel knows, even as his fingers are getting a little numb, that within a half an hour someone will be there to take his turn at the wheel. And a half hour later someone else will take his turn at the wheel. You ever take your turn at school? Say yes, you do, because I know you do. And every time you use that phrase, to take your turn, the turn you're talking about is the turn of a sandglass on a sailing ship. Originally, that phrase, to take your turn, defined a period of responsibility. Your turn of the glass at the wheel of your ship, or perhaps as lookout. When those sailors came home, they brought the language of the sea with them. And over time, to take your turn was enlarged to include not just a period of responsibility, but also a period of opportunity, like your turn at a game. That phrase, to take your turn, is used exactly the same way in English, Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese. If you speak any of those 5 languages, think about it and nod your head and let them know what I'm talking about. Yeah. All were seafaring nations, all used a similar system. We are connected to our history in all sorts of ways. We in the National Park System know, like other historians, that those who fail to study the mistakes made in history are doomed to repeat those mistakes. And so we kind of hope to inspire people like these to look into it. And when I talk to the kids, I'll tell them, if you want to know what's going to happen next, look at history. Look what happened the last time we were in this situation. The technology is different, the people are exactly different. If you have any questions about anything you've seen here, anything I've mentioned, I'll be glad to answer what I can. Otherwise,